Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and you're watching Culturally Determined. And my guest today is Jesse Singal. Jesse, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I edit Science of Us, which is New York Magazine's social science website.
Great, so thanks for coming on today. And the reason I wanted to have you on was you wrote this really interesting, long reported piece about a story that's been in the news in the last couple of weeks about a social science study that got a lot of press when it first came out and then was debunked and proved to be seemingly totally fraudulent. So could you first tell us about kind of like what we knew about this study before the debunking came out?
Yeah, so the study came out in December in the journal Science, and you know, we covered it on Science of Us. Everybody covered it, including the Times and This American Life, because what it showed is that if you send gay canvassers to the doors of California voters, and they have a quick conversation about gay rights and gay marriage, in which they mention they're gay and sort of tell a little bit about their experience. These results showed it had a profound effect on the voters' opinions about gay people and gay marriage. And, you know, this was sort of a pretty striking result because a lot of past research into political persuasion showed that it's really not an easy thing to do. When you do shift people's opinions, they tend to sort of snap back for the most part. And in this case, the researchers showed the effects they lasted for 9 months, and they were actually contagious within the household. So even if you yourself didn't talk to a canvasser, if your husband or wife or roommate did, these results purported to show that you would have been affected too.
Mm-hmm. And so the primary researcher was a grad student at UCLA whose name was Michael LaCour.
Yep.
And I mean, you talked a little bit about why they were so surprising. I mean, one thing I thought was that kind of this study got a lot of press because it kind of it makes us feel good in kind of like a TED Talky kind of way. Like,
yeah,
it plays on our like natural sympathies, and at least many liberals are naturally sympathetic towards gay people, and it seemed to just seem like, oh, we just need to have a conversation, and then you can change minds.
Yeah, I mean, we're good liberals. We believe in diversity. We believe in the contact hypothesis, this idea that if you can just get different kinds of people to communicate with each other, it'll improve understanding. But, yeah, these results were sort of so strong that, you know, myself included, we should have all been a lot more skeptical, because it's just not really how the world works, to the extent that we know how persuasion works.
Right. Well, I mean, so what's a more traditional understanding of how persuasion works or doesn't work?
Yeah, I mean, one type of experiment they'll do is they'll drag a bunch of undergrads into a lab and test sort of different messages or different sorts of framing on gay marriage or climate change. And there have been some small effects showing, like, if you use different liberal messages on liberals or conservatives, for example, some of them are more effective than others. But these aren't huge effects, and there really isn't a lot of research showing that you can permanently nudge people's views. On issues like global warming, the idea of how you get conservatives to believe in it, which is, you know, something I've written about, there aren't any good answers yet. So what these guys said they'd found, what LaCour and Green said they'd found, is we've got what looks like an answer on the gay rights issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this got a lot of press. There was we'll link to the some of the positive press that first came out. Like you said, there was This American Life segment, which is where I first heard about it. And so for a scientific study, this was really like breaking out and getting a lot of attention. And then some intrepid grad students started questioning the data. So how did the debunking come about?
Yeah, what was interesting about our story was, so it was eventually debunked by David Brockman and Joshua Kalla, who are both graduate students at UC Berkeley. And sort of later on, they brought on Peter Aronow, who's a stats-minded political scientist at Yale. And they released a report sort of tracing their suspicions back to January of this year. But, you know, when I talked to Brockman, he said that his suspicions started back in 2013, when LaCour first showed him this data. Brockman wanted to run a survey like this, and he sort of ran the numbers for how much it would cost. And he found it would cost about $1 million, which is not an amount of money a grad student in political science usually has. So from the very beginning, he said there was like some little inkling of doubt about how this could all have been real. And then it was sort of a matter of along the way, more and more statistical evidence emerging.
Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things that you report in your story is that Brockman was continually dissuaded from speaking out publicly or trying to take down the LaCour study. Can you talk about kind of that social pressure within the discipline?
So I think it's important that people not misunderstand here. It's not like Brockman had smoking gun evidence for a year and everyone just told him to stay quiet or his career was ruined. It was more that he had early suspicions that would turn out to be valid. And when he brought them to sort of friends and advisors, they said, look, either there's a logical explanation, in which case you'll be damaging people's careers for no reason, or there really is something here, but it just wouldn't benefit you professionally to have your name attached to these allegations.
Mm-hmm. And we can talk about this a little bit more later, but that seems to be kind of a systemic problem within the field. So, I mean, why do you think that it took a rogue grad student to figure this out? How was these fraud just really well done, or was there something about the credulousness of the reviewers? Why did it take so long for this to be uncovered?
That's sort of the biggest question I've been trying to figure out, and I think it's much more about credulousness and I guess a trust problem in academia, in that there's arguably too much of it. This was not a well-done fraud. The stats tricks he did to fake the data were not hard to detect in retrospect. Basically, the entire acknowledgement section of the science article, the section that comes at the very end, all easily checked, all false, basically. So his CV had all kinds of grants he didn't receive, a teaching award that was made up. At any point, someone could have made one phone call and really cast serious doubt on LaCour and the stories he was telling. So I think it's more that there's just not, in the way in magazines we have a norm, ideally, of fact-checking a story before it comes out, at least in print. And those norms don't really exist in political science or in the social sciences. And I hope that this nudges things a little bit in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And we should note that the original paper was published in Science, which is, as I understand it, the flagship scientific journal.
It's called Science. It has.
So LaCour has offered some kind of response. I mean, is there anything to what he's saying now? Does he have any defense for what?
No,
the evidence is?
It's really weird. It's a little bit in the statistical weeds, but basically he made an argument. One of his arguments sort of has nothing to do with the actual charges against him. Because the biggest thing he's accused of doing, or one of them, is faking the name of the employee of the survey company he used. The survey company used to be called USAM. And he never worked with them. We published an email where he forwarded a faked conversation from one of their vice presidents. Now, that's a pretty big allegation, and yet he released this, I think, 27-page PDF that he said was a response to his critics that doesn't mention that. So he hasn't been able to prove that he actually did any of the survey data, and it's increasingly clear he just didn't. So I don't think. I think there's a consensus that there's nothing in his response that seriously addresses the charges against him.
Mm-hmm. One of the other ways that I guess LaCour was able to perpetrate this fraud was that he got a well-known professor named Donald Green to collaborate with him on the paper, and you interviewed Green. I mean, how do you see Green's role in this, and how much culpability does Green himself have for not figuring out that this was a fake?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. To me, there's one story in my story that explains almost everything you didn't know about the power dynamics at work here. There was a guy named John Krosnick. He's a Stanford social psychologist. He gets a call from a This American Life reporter. Krosnick at this point has never heard of the study. The reporter explains to him the results of the study. Krosnick says, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound possible. Krosnick pulls up the study on his computer. He sees Don Green's name, and he says to the reporter, to This American Life reporter, oh, Don Green's name is on this. It must be real. It must be valid. So Green's name carried so much weight that as soon as LaCour got him as a co-author, it just made it, people were much more credulous. And I think on the question of Green's responsibility, I got a statement from him where he said, I take responsibility, but it's not full responsibility, but he's admitted he's culpable. I don't think it's that unusual, and this is something I'm still trying to get a better sense of, to have sort of a senior figure as a co-author on a paper and have the junior researcher really doing much more of the work. Like, I think it's usual for the senior guy to sort of be like, we'll give you some advice on how to do the experimental design, but I don't think there's anything inherently unusual in the fact that LaCour was sort of the data guy and owned that part of it.
Mm-hmm. And was LaCour the first listed author on the
Yep,
piece?
There were just two authors. It was LaCour then Green.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what is your sense? I guess I'm assuming that LaCour did not consent to an interview with you. What is your sense of him? Is he kind of a fabulous, like, Stephen Glass? Do you think maybe that seems to be, evidence is mounting for that, where you're finding, things on his CV that aren't accurate? Or do you think maybe he started out trying to do this study and got in over his head in some way?
I edited a website about human psychology, so I'm fascinated by this question, and I sort of like vacillate because I'll try to understand what could be going through the head of someone like this, but you just sort of hit a wall. I mean, how can you explain someone who is dishonest this often and in so many unnecessary, self-defeating ways? Because a lot of these lies, like in retrospect, weren't really getting him anything or weren't getting him anything worth the risk. I mean, we reported yesterday this sort of sad incident where he's trying to fake a document involving just this pre-registration thing for an experiment. And over and over again, there's just sort of like a really clumsy, sloppy aspect to it. You sort of get the sense that he just couldn't stop, and that's complete speculation. I don't know the guy. I haven't talked to him except in a brief exchange, but I don't know. He's like this mystery, fascinating figure at the center of all this, and I wish I knew more about him.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this American Life will get the interview with him.
Where they bring, who was the other guy?
Well,
the China guy?
Mike Daisy.
I feel bad for Ira Glass. He's had a rough couple of years in terms of fabulous.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that kind of gets back to the TED Talk thing. When you're looking for a good story, sometimes the good story isn't actually true, and the social science results that are blockbusters will tell a good story, but then a lot of social science results probably show some minor effect or something that is not game changing or anything like that.
Yeah, and when you talk to responsible science journalists, they'll tell you, like, you can't put too much weight in any one study, because any given study probably has problems. There's statistical noise. This study really seduced people because the effects were so strong. It was published in Science, and Don Green was on the name, and it told us something we wanted to believe. Like, there's clearly a confirmation bias element at work here.
Right, and the uncovering, I can't remember if we've mentioned this already, but the uncovering really came about because Brockman wanted to replicate the study for his own research, and that was when he found out that it was just like impossible to do what he did on any sort of budget that a grad student would ever have. So, kind of replicability is one of the internal checks in the world of science and social science research, and so the system kind of worked in some ways.
That's the debate people are having. I think it's hard to say the system worked because the result was published, and it led to grant money being dispersed. It led to people changing their own research agendas. So I don't want to say it worked, but it's reassuring that he was caught. And I don't think frauds of this magnitude are at all common. I think that the actual everyday problems are smaller and involve sort of statistical trickery and journalists writing stuff up credulously. It's just this was so devastating for political science and for LGBT activists and advocates that something really did fail to work here. I don't think we can tell any coherent story about how quote unquote things working.
Right. Yeah. You shouldn't have to rely on a random grad student to.
No. Yeah. Exactly.
To figure this stuff out. So what are some possible reforms that are being talked about that could have prevented the publication of this paper in the beginning?
I don't. I think people are still sort of in the immediate aftershock of it. I haven't seen much, concrete talk yet. What I will say is interesting is that, I talked to one relatively prominent political scientist, and I said, so the stuff on his CV, that was all fake. Why couldn't you hire an undergrad? And whenever someone's applying for a job, check 3 things at random, just to catch the big liars. And what he told me, which I found surprising, was, well, that could sort of introduce a culture of distrust. We can't assume people are liars. And to me, that's such like a different attitude than what you see in other fields, where there's got to be some middle ground between assuming everyone's a liar and letting someone like LaCour make crazy claims on his CV. So to the extent this leads to reforms, I hope they're sort of the low-cost, high-reward variety. Like, just check a couple items on someone's CV. That shouldn't be a complicated thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And if the study itself had been more properly vetted by the reviewers, would they have been able to, do you think, catch that this was a fraud, or it was kind of by chance that Brockman was interested in it and he was the one who found it?
What I can say is that as soon as Brockman had a little bit of time with the raw data, discrepancies came out. And the sorts of stuff that aren't on their own a smoking gun, but stuff that would prompt further investigation. So I'm not privy to the details of how the study was reviewed. I do know it was rejected by one other publication, which is sort of something I'm looking into. But these were not... LaCour did not do a crazy sophisticated job in faking it. He basically took a pre-existing data set and then added this sort of really obvious noise to it. So no one I've talked to who knows the statistics said that he was some super fabulous on the stats from.
Mm-hmm. What do we actually know about how effective this type of canvassing is in changing minds once we throw this study out the window?
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge of this basically just comes from Brockman, and he mentioned work Green's done, and I think the evidence is canvassing can have an effect, like a face-to-face conversation can have an effect on things like, actually getting people to vote, and other areas where, social pressure or appealing to social norms has been shown to have an impact. But things like changing your political opinions, I think that process works a lot more slowly, and it's a little bit more complicated than, say, getting someone to vote.
Yeah, I think really it really is kind of like we good liberals wanted to believe that this was true, when if social science research, it is very hard to change people's beliefs. So there's I believe there's studies showing if you show a committed partisan a essay that makes the opposite case on some issue from what they believe in, they'll just believe their side even more.
Yeah, the backlash effect, exactly.
Yeah, so this was kind of fooled everyone because they just wanted to believe it was true.
But I will say, in defense of social science, I've seen some sort of some conservatives now crowing about how, academia only publishes results, that support a liberal agenda. That's not true at all. The whole reason this study got everyone's attention is because there'd been such a body of research showing you can't easily, from their point of view, turn people into liberal zombies or whatever. That was why this study stood out. So I think there is a problem with confirmation bias in terms of why this study got covered. I'm not sure how endemic it is in terms of how results are shaded when they come out. Although, that's probably worth investigating too.
Mm-hmm. Now, you closed your piece with a really interesting metaphor from Brockman, who was gay, about coming out of the closet. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, he said, he grew up in Austin, Texas, and he said his coming out story was not some horrific small town Texas thing. He said, it was difficult as it is, but he said it wasn't tragic or anything. But what he did say is the same thing happened with this and with figuring out these discrepancies in the data, where he had this knowledge that basically only he had, and he wasn't sure how the community at large would respond to it, and he worried that he wouldn't be accepted after it came out. I mean, I think this should be emphasized. Brockman really thought after he revealed this fraud there'd be some sort of backlash against him. And instead what he found is after they released the report, everyone congratulated him, as they should. And he said the same thing happened when he came out of the closet, where it was just this hugely liberating thing, and people accepted him for who he was. And he was basically too pessimistic about how people would respond.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, the pressure not to go after the big fish is interesting to me, and it can, it kind of seems like that's how people like, Free Zakaria, for example. It's not exactly the same, but he's been shown repeatedly that articles he's written have been plagiarized, and he usually blames it on, some assistant of his who was like gathering research and stuff like that. And, gunning for the big fish is a way like in journalism that you make a name for yourself if you take down somebody like Jonah Lehrer or Zakaria. I guess maybe it's just a much more insular community in political science, and everyone knows each other, and it would be, if you try to take someone down and you fail, then maybe the stigma attaches to you instead.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think it's like a double-pronged thing where you're also not supposed to go after people at your station, because then you're seen as sort of throwing elbows. But it's complicated. Like, social scientists are challenging each other's research all the time. I think it's more when you get into anything that has a whiff of an accusation of fraud. That's when people feel like they have to be really, really careful before coming forward.
Right, and they were certainly very Brockman and his collaborators were certainly very meticulous in laying out their charges, and within 24 hours, I believe, Science had retracted the paper.
Well, it was within a day or two. Green had sent a request that it be retracted. I think that actual retraction took another week. But once sort of the first domino was knocked over, the rest fell really quickly, and that was because they gathered all their evidence and brought it to Green, so that Green could then Green brought it to LaCour's advisor. She asked him about it, and they basically set it up in a way where they would not give LaCour a chance to sort of suddenly make up a story at the last minute, which he has been shown to do since then repeatedly. So, I think they were very meticulous, and that helped things move so quickly.
Right. So, what do you think? What do you think is going to happen to LaCour? Apparently, he had an offer at Princeton, and it seems the Princeton hasn't commented, but it does seem like they would probably rescind the offer. Do you think his career is basically over?
Yeah, well, it's funny. He was supposed to help teach the introductory class at the Woodrow Wilson School, where I went for grad school, which is like this introductory poli-sci class, and a big part of it is writing these policy memos that often deal with like ethically tricky situations. So he would have been grading those. There's like online rumors about how Princeton's going to have trouble firing him or rescinding its offer, or UCLA. Well, from what little I know of the process, that's like impossible, because his PhD was based on research that didn't exist, and Princeton's offer to him was extended based on research that didn't exist. So
this paper was his PhD, like this was his dissertation?
I think I'm actually not positive. I think an earlier version. Yeah, I mean, this was what he was doing, this research, for like 2 years. So I'm not sure what the divide is between his actual dissertation and the science paper, but this was his stuff. And it turns out it was all appears to have all been based on survey work that never took place. So, I don't think either institution is going to have trouble. I think they're both being quiet now because, like, in the first days when you're still investigating, every lawyer will tell you, what's the point of, like, making any statement? Just keep quiet.
Right, but, I mean, I guess I do feel a little bit sorry for this guy, but maybe that's just the bleeding heart liberal.
No. I'm also a bleeding heart liberal. I absolutely feel bad for him. I think of what his life is like right now, and it sucks, and it's hard to imagine what he thought. It's not hard to imagine what he thought he would gain. He thought he would gain academic acclaim, and briefly he did. It's hard to imagine that he thought he could sort of slither out of all these tabulations. It's really hard to comprehend.
Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to say about this fascinating story?
No, I mean, I hope we all reflect, and again, I'm including myself, because I wrote a glowing write-up of the study. There's really interesting conversations to be had about the relationship between social science and the media and the broader public, and everybody got fooled here. So we should keep that in mind the next time there's a really exciting study, everyone's crowing about.
So when we are reading your work on the science of us, we will take it with a grain
Yeah,
of salt.
it's all completely false.
And remember, there's also these issues with the replicability crisis, and no single study should influence us too strongly. I think would be kind of a general lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, Jesse Singal, thank you so much for coming on Blogging Heads with me. We will link to the articles you've written about this, which are definitely worth reading, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime soon.
Hey, Sarah, thanks for having me.
No problem. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.